Have you ever been stuck in traffic and switched lanes only to watch your old lane start moving faster? Or perhaps you've stood in a grocery line, debating whether to move to the shorter line, knowing others are thinking the same thing? Welcome to Game Theory in Action. Hello, you're listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University, where we ask the bold questions that will become innovations for the betterment of humanity. Today, we dive into the fascinating world of game theory, the strategic decision-making that shapes everything from your daily commute to international trade agreements and even how we parent our children. This episode is the first of a two-part series called Game Theory Decoded. I'm Randy Scott. My guest is Kevin Zollman, the Herbert A. Simon Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Institute for Complex Social Dynamics at Carnegie Mellon University. Kevin is a leading game theorist who has applied these principles to everything, from parenting to scientific research. Game theory might sound academic, but as we'll soon discover, it's a powerful lens for understanding and impacting human interaction. In the first episode, we'll explore the fundamentals of game theory and its real-world practical applications. In part 2, we'll examine how game theory can be used for the betterment of humanity and where this field is headed next. Kevin, welcome to Where What If Becomes What's Next. All right, let's start with the basics. What exactly is game theory and why should our listeners care about it?
So game theory is the science of strategic thinking. So it's a theory that uses a lot of mathematics to try and understand any kind of social behavior. So it was invented initially in economics to study economic behavior like labor disputes or contract negotiations or how businesses decide on pricing. But very quickly after it was invented, it expanded to cover a large number of other potential applications. So it was applied to biology, where it's been used to study viruses, bacteria, plants, and animals. It's been used in international relations to study how different countries interact. It's been used to understand social behavior of why people do things they do in marriage or child rearing. So it's one of these theories that started with a very narrow set of applications, but became applicable to almost any social interaction where two or more individuals are interacting with each other in a way that they care about what the other one is doing, what we call a strategic situation.
Wait. You said invented. When was game theory first developed, and who's credited with creating it?
People always put the point on it being invented in the 1940s by John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. There's a book called The Theory of Games and Economic Behavior, which is sort of the first time that it was sort of collected together in a single place. But the ideas that they drew on go back centuries. You can see bits and pieces of game theoretic reasoning in the Bible. You can find it in Thomas Hobbes' a treatise on government. You can find it in Plato. You can find it in Adam Smith. The ideas were around, but sort of coalesced into a singular theory in the 1930s and 40s.
I get it. They named it and formalized it, but why the word game? That might seem confusing to people thinking about board games or sports.
That's definitely right. And it's one of those things where it's kind of an analogy. So game theory does apply to Monopoly, to poker, to Go and chess, and all of those things that we traditionally think about as games. But it also applies to lots of other situations. And what it does that by kind of making an analogy between what we think of as trivial or games for fun and ordinary interactions. So in chess, one of the things that we do is we think a couple moves ahead. If I do this, what is my opponent going to do? And then when she does that, what am I going to do? But that kind of thinking is something that we do every day in ordinary interactions too. So you might plan ahead for a meeting with a boss where you're going to ask for a raise. And you think, well, I'm going to say this, and then my boss will say this in response. And then what will I say in response? And so it is definitely a sort of weird word to use because these feel very serious. They're not really games in the colloquial sense. But the thing that game theory showed is that there's a kind of surprising analogy between the way we think in a game and the way we think in reality. And that's no accident because games like chess were invented as analogies for war. There's always been this flow back and forth between real life social interaction and games. And game theory sort of says, hey, wait, why don't we think of all of these things as just one thing?
So game theory applies when you have individuals or groups making strategic decisions, where there could be cooperation or competition, winners, losers. Is that right?
Absolutely. So the critical thing that game theory always points out is that win-loss games or zero-sum games are definitely a part of game theory, but they're not the entirety of game theory. So there are games where one side wins and one side loses, but there are also games where people can work together, and by collaborating, they both end up better off. So most of the classic games that we think about that we play, like chess and Go and Monopoly, are games where one side wins and one side loses. But there are lots of other games in game theory where we both do well together because we cooperate, or they're much more complicated where some cooperation is valuable, but there is also some competition, like in wage negotiations or things like that. So there are lots of different kinds of examples. And one of the things that game theory is really powerful for is helping you think about it by categorizing it. Is this a zero-sum situation? Or is this a cooperative situation? Or is this what we call a mixed motive or something kind of in between game?
Okay, I heard you mention zero-sum games. Can you explain what that term means?
So zero sum to a game theorist means that when one party gains, another party has to lose. So the idea here is that a zero sum interaction is an interaction where every gain by one party is offset by a loss to another. So that can be a two-party interaction. So for instance, if I'm taking money from you, that's a zero-sum game. Poker is a zero-sum game, for instance. But it can also be a multi-party. So it can be a zero-sum game with 10 or 15 or 1,000 people. And then all that means is if one person is gaining somewhere, then you have to be able to find someone else or some set of other people who are losing somewhere else. So that's what a zero-sum game is. But anytime that you have a situation where people can work together and benefit one another, that's not a zero-sum game. So things like trade, most economic exchanges, in fact, are not zero-sum because we both gain by me buying your product or something like that.
Okay, well, let's talk about two other concepts in game theory that our listeners may have heard of: the Nash Equilibrium and the prisoner's dilemma. How about you explain what these are and why they're important?
So the Nash Equilibrium is named after John Nash, who is not the person who first discovered the idea, but the person who proved that it always exists. And so that's what he's really famous for. The movie A Beautiful Mind is based on John Nash's life. The one sad thing is that the screenwriter got the idea of Nash Equilibrium wrong when they describe it in the movie. So every game theorist is irked by the movie because it's not right. The idea of a Nash Equilibrium is it's a point in a game where no player could benefit by changing their strategy. So the idea here is that it's a point where everybody is not necessarily as happy as they could be, but they can't improve their situation by doing something different unilaterally. So the question was, until John Nash proved this, was, are there always such points? Is it always possible? And what John Nash showed is that it is always possible so long as you consider the possibility that people might flip coins or roll dice so that they might choose at random. So a simple illustration of this idea is take the children's game rock, paper, scissors. If I choose just to play rock no matter what, and you choose to play scissors no matter what, that's not an equilibrium because I'm winning, you're losing, and you could make your situation better by switching from scissors to paper. And that's true of any particular thing that we might play. But if I choose what I'm going to play at random, so I choose rock with a third probability, paper with a third probability, and scissors with a third probability, then there's nothing that you can do to improve your situation. Everything is equally good, everything is equally bad. And so if we both do that, that's a Nash equilibrium. Nobody can make their situation better or worse. And what Nash proved is that when you allow people to roll dice or flip coins, this equilibrium always exists. It's important because it means that that's a kind of prediction about what we might think. At least people who are familiar with the game and have played a lot with one another will eventually come to settle on. That's what happens with rock, paper, scissors. Why don't adults play rock, paper, scissors? Because we all figured out that's exactly what you should do, and that's the end of it.
Okay, and Nash proved it mathematically, right?
He did, yes. And that was considered really an impressive thing at the time. John Nash, interestingly, since I'm at Carnegie Mellon, was an undergraduate here at Carnegie Mellon.
Okay, I heard that Nash also received his master's in mathematics from CMU. So now let's talk about the prisoner's dilemma.
Prisoner's Dilemma is a very famous game, which gets used a lot to illustrate game theory, and is actually sometimes thought of as kind of a counterintuitive result of game theory. The idea about the Prisoner's Dilemma is, and this is one of those stories that you've seen on every cop procedural. Two people are suspected to have committed a serious crime. The police have them and can convict them of committing a relatively minor crime, jaywalking, but they suspect that maybe they committed murder. So they take the two potential criminals, they put them in different rooms, and they go to each of them and they say, here's what we're going to do. We're going to offer you a deal. You can confess that you and the other guy committed this more serious crime, say murder. And if you confess and the other guy doesn't, then we're going to let you off scot-free. You're not going to get a ticket for jaywalking, and you're not going to go to jail for the murder because we'll need your testimony against the other one. So if both prisoners confess, we don't need your testimony. So you'll go to jail for murder. If you stay silent and the other guy confesses, well, now you're in real trouble because you're going to go to jail for jaywalking and also for the murder because the other guy's going to testify against you. But if you both stay silent, we've got you on the jaywalking, but we won't have enough to convict you of the murder. What do you want to do? So that's the prisoner's dilemma. It's a game in game theory.
Okay, a little tricky, but I think I get it. Each of the prisoners, when acting in what they believe is their self-interest by confessing and betraying the other, actually creates a worse outcome, conviction on the murder charge. But if both prisoners remain silent, in essence, they cooperate with each other, and they both get off on the lesser charge.
And that's thought of as really counterintuitive, and lots of people have struggled to make sense of it.
Okay, so why should people, though, who aren't criminals even care about the prisoner's dilemma? How does it relate to everyday life?
So it's of interest because it's a sort of illustration of a certain kind of common conflict. What's happening in the prisoner's dilemma is that there's a conflict between what's good for the individual and what's good for the group, and we find those kinds of things everywhere. Game theorists call these social dilemmas.
Social dilemmas. Now, can you give us some examples of social dilemmas?
Pollution is a social dilemma, right? Each of us has a kind of private incentive to drive more than we should, to burn more fossil fuels than we should, but it makes us all worse off from global warming. So contributing to charities is another example. Each of us would benefit if charities had more money, but we each have a private incentive to spend that money on a fancy dinner or a nicer car or whatever. And so there are lots of circumstances where we face these social dilemmas. And the prisoner's dilemma is nice because it's this super simple, very small example of what is a really common problem. And so by analyzing how that works, we hope to get better grip on why is it that people do contribute to charities? Why is it that people are willing to do things that benefit others, like reduce their fossil fuel usage and things like that? And so that analogy helps us to understand what is a much more complicated system by looking at a simpler version and then scaling up from there.
All right, that's a lot to take in, so we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll dig deeper into more ways that game theory is applied to the real world.
This podcast is brought to you by Carnegie Mellon University. Located in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, CMU is a private, international research university, consistently ranked among the top universities in the world. Its trailblazing research is focused on creating, defining, and accelerating the future of artificial intelligence. For more information, please visit ai.cmu.edu.
Welcome back. You are listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University. We're talking with Kevin Zollman, a professor of philosophy and director of the Institute for Complex Social Dynamics at Carnegie Mellon University and a leading game theorist. Kevin, we were talking about the fundamentals of game theory earlier, so let's move on from that, from theory to practice. Where do we see game theory showing up in everyday life?
Game theory is one of those things that shows up everywhere. It's used all across the academy. So it's in almost, any discipline that deals with social interaction has used game theory in one way or another. In terms of everyday life, it's underlying an enormous amount of economic interaction. So when you see an ad on Google, for example, Google uses game theory to decide what prices to charge, or actually, in fact, how to design the auction that they run for how they sell ads to you. Informally, game theory shows up in almost any social interaction that you might have. So if you have interactions with your spouse or with your child or with a person at a store or with an Uber driver, anything like that, without knowing it necessarily by that topic, you're engaging in game theoretic reasoning. Anytime you're thinking, what's that other person going to do? Or they're thinking, what might you do? You're engaged in some kind of, informal maybe, but nonetheless game theoretic reasoning of some kind.
Okay, so you've written about how game theory applies to seemingly mundane decisions, like changing lanes in traffic or maybe even just switching lines at the bank. How about you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yep, absolutely. And those are great examples because it's, suppose that you're, on the highway and you see that the lane next to you is moving faster. You have to decide, should I get over or should I stay in the current lane? Well, if everyone gets over, then you wish you had stayed, right? Because now your lane's moving and the other lane's slow. And if nobody gets over, well, then you wish you would have gotten over because now the other lane will continue to move fast and your lane will be slow. So anytime that you're trying to decide, should I switch, you're either explicitly or implicitly making a decision about what you think the other drivers are going to do. Do you think they're all going to switch or do you think they're all going to stay? Same thing in the grocery store or the bank. If you see that, oh, it looks a little shorter over there, but I got a big cart. So if I start moving, maybe 6 people in front of me also move, and then I would have done better by staying here. Exactly the same sort of thing. And so that's a game theoretic circumstance where you're trying to reason about what other people are going to do in order to decide what you should do yourself.
Okay, that actually reminds me of a personal story. So my buddy was driving to a baseball game in Houston, and the highway was jammed. On the radio, the helicopter traffic reporter said people should get off the highway and take an alternate route. So he did, along with everyone else. The alternate route became completely jammed while the highway actually opened up. Is that game theory at work?
Yeah, exactly. And that's in the early days, even of Google Maps, this was a problem because in the early days of Google Maps, it would sit down and it would say, okay, well, this looks faster right now, so we'll tell everybody to do it. But then as Google Maps navigation became more and more popular, then they started to recognize that they can't send everybody on the same route because that'll just make that worse. And so now they engage in that kind of reasoning where they send some people one way and some people the other way, specifically in order to try and balance those things out, precisely because Google Maps became the new version of that, helicopter radio announcer about traffic. And you can just make everybody, do what seems like the right thing at the moment. But if everybody does it, it becomes the wrong thing.
So you've also written a book about applying game theory to parenting, which is fascinating. Tell us about how these principles can help parents navigate the challenges of raising kids, because I'm a parent, and trust me, my wife and I will take any help we can get.
Yeah, so the book is called The Game Theorist's Guide to Parenting, and I co-authored it with science writer Paul Rayburn. He was the parenting expert. I don't have any kids, but he had enough for both of us. We used to joke. So it was a really great collaboration because I knew the game theory, and he knew both science writing and also parenting. And what the book does is it goes through a number of kind of common parenting conundrums and talks about solutions that parents might already know for narrow solutions, but talk about how it's applicable to a huge variety of different circumstances. So, for example, one of the ones that we talk about is a lot of parents know the trick, I cut, you pick. So you've got 2 kids, you've got a piece of cake that they have to divide between them in order to eat. How do you do so that they both feel like they got a fair deal? Where you have one of the kids cut the piece of cake in half, and then you let the other kid choose which piece they want. That's a game theory game. It creates an incentive for the first kid to choose as fairly as possible, because if they make one big piece and one small piece, well, the other one's going to choose the big piece. So it's a great trick. And most parents know it.
That's good stuff and probably going to prevent a lot of hurt feelings at birthday parties.
So you can do it with things in addition to cake. You can do it with time. Right? So you can say, okay, you both can play an hour of video games. One of you maybe wants to play first. Maybe one of you wants to play later. How about one of you decide to divide that hour into 2 chunks, and then the other one gets to pick which chunk they want. So maybe the person who plays first gets a little less time. Maybe it's 20 minutes and 40 minutes or something like that. And you can use it that way. You can use it with parental time, right? So if you have more than one kid and that, they have many different recitals or sports games or things that they want the parent to attend, you can say, okay, one of you divide up all of the activities into 2 piles, and then the other one choose which pile they want. So it's one of these insights that it for one thing, but when you see its sort of structure, all of a sudden it becomes applicable to many different things.
Mm-hmm. And your book goes beyond these I cut, you pick challenges, right?
We talk about other sort of parenting conundrums, like how to get your kids to clean up rooms together, or how do you get your kids to communicate honestly with you if there's concern that they're lying to you about how much homework they have. How do you encourage them to get good grades? And we run through different game theory insights that have been applied to other things other than parenting and show how they're relevant to parenting conundrums.
All right, so I'm realizing that I've used similar techniques with my own kids, like trying to give them choices rather than commands. Is that a game theory principle?
And this is something that's really powerful, and we talk about it a little bit. It's game theorists and political scientists call this the power of agenda setting. That one of the things that is enormously powerful is if you get to dictate what the options are. So if you think about Congress deciding which bills are going to come to the floor in order to be voted on and what those bills contain is an enormous power. But this is exactly the power that the parent wields, right? When you come in and say, would you like to get ready for school, yes or no? Well, I mean, I know the answer to that question, no, right? But if you come in and you say, would you like the red shoes or the black shoes? Now, not getting ready to school is not on the agenda. It's not something that they can choose between. And so the power of agenda setting is something that parents use all the time by crafting what we call the menu of options that the child has to choose from, and doing so in a way that gives them agency, makes them feel like they're involved in the process, but also controls things a little bit by removing some things that they maybe really want to do, like sleep in, from the available options.
All right, so let's move beyond the household. How is game theory applied in business, in government, and broader social contexts?
So a big topic of discussion is what are called bargaining games. And bargaining games are games where you have some resource that you're trying to divide between two people or two groups of people, and you're trying to figure out how do you divide that in a way that is beneficial to both parties. So this is exactly the theory that underlies things like union negotiations, or even if there's not a union, individual contract negotiations between employers and employees. The idea being, if I come to work for your company, I bring something. I give the company a benefit. Now, I would like some of that benefit back in return in the form of a salary, benefits, vacation days, whatever. And so now we have to decide what amount of what I bring to the company is the company going to return to me? How much of that? If they return it all, that's great for me, but bad for the company. If they don't return any of it, then that's great for the company and bad for me. So bargaining games are used to try and understand that. That's a great example in business.
And we know that bargaining is a big part of government and public policy, right?
The Democrats and the Republicans bargain, especially when the Democrats control the Senate, but the Republicans control the House or whatever, then there's a lot of bargaining that goes on because there's some benefit that they want to divide. They want to pass a budget or govern or whatever, but also there are things that benefit one party more than they benefit the other. And it gets used all the way up into like the negotiations about climate change and the Paris agreements and these sorts of things, where the idea is, who's going to reduce their emissions by how much is another kind of bargain. We all want to reduce our emissions, but it would obviously, each country would like it if everyone else did more and they did less. And so figuring out who's going to do what at what rates is a huge bargain. Bargaining is one of those things that gets studied at game theory and applies from bargaining with your kids all the way up to bargaining at the UN.
So businesses are often seen as competitors, but game theory suggests it's more complicated than that, right?
Yeah. And that's one of those things where oftentimes the way this gets described is way too simple. And one of the things that game theorists say is that, like, you might think, for instance, take two gas stations that are right across the street from one another. We classically think of that as kind of like a zero-sum situation. They're competing with each other. One of them is going to get more business and the other is going to get less. But if they can cooperate, that is, if they can fix prices, they both could benefit at the expense of all of the rest of us, because they could agree to charge even higher prices and not compete with one another. The reason that governments make that illegal is because that would be great for those businesses, but bad for the rest of us. So that's why antitrust legislation, price fixing legislation, that's why those things are made illegal. Because if we don't make it illegal, or if we don't enforce those rules, then we'll all end up paying higher prices. And the people who benefit are just the two people who own those gas stations, while the rest of us end up paying higher prices.
Okay, so what's next for game theorists? Should companies and governments have dedicated game theory experts to help with strategic decisions? A chief gaming officer, or maybe a cabinet position?
I love it. I love the idea. There should be one everywhere. It's one of those things where somewhere in a company, there'll be somebody who's taken some game theory courses, because it shows up in the economics curriculum. It shows up in political science curriculum. It's showing up more and more now, even in philosophy curriculum, which is where I am. And so game theory is one of those things that people are starting to get a sense for more. But I do think that actually having like a professional game theorist is really useful. And I think that having those kinds of people as consultants, either permanently in a company or hiring them as consultants for certain kinds of strategic situations are really helpful, because game theorists have a particular way of thinking through a problem that helps to sort of chunk it up into parts and then put it back together that I think can oftentimes be really, really helpful. And, one of the things that I do, even in my everyday life, is sit down and just run through how would a game theorist think about this? And it oftentimes gets me to a conclusion faster or shows me a new option that I didn't necessarily see that was there before in a way that can be really, really helpful.
I've heard that what's next for game theory could be in scientific research, which seems to me the opposite of game theory.
It feels like it should be, but this is one of the things that actually is a really exciting new area for game theory research right now. The idea here is to think about scientists as playing games of a certain kind with one another, because, of course, science is about advancing our knowledge, but it's not just about advancing our knowledge, right? That scientists have to make choices. Think about a traffic analogy, right? If every other scientist is working on one problem, well, the best thing for me to do probably is work on a different problem. Because what's the chance that I'm going to make an advance in the same, if I'm doing exactly the same thing that everybody else is versus doing something new? And so just like in traffic, if everybody's in the right lane, you'd rather be in the left lane. In science, if everybody's working on one problem, you might want to work on a different one. And so thinking about how scientists choose what kinds of problems to work on is itself a game theory problem. And so that's one of the things that we're really interested in.
But game theory isn't just about the scientists. What about the things they study? For example, are bacteria using game theory on us?
Oh, actually, they are too, the bacteria. So game theory was applied to the animal world first in the 1970s by John Maynard Smith, who's a very famous biologist, and George Price. And the two of them applied game theory to the animal kingdom. And we figured out that it applies all the way from viruses, bacteria, plants, animals. And it's the same sort of thing. They're, of course, not thinking through the game, right? It's not like a bacteria is saying, oh, what's this other bacterium going to do? And da. But we found examples of even things like rock, paper, scissors in bacteria. So there's a particular strain of E. coli where there's a kind of regular type who doesn't do anything. There's a type that produces a toxin that kills the regular type. And then there's another type which is immune from the toxin, but doesn't produce it. And it turns out that if you have a population of the regular type, the one that produces the toxin does better. So that's like rock beats scissors. The immune type does better when everyone is producing the toxin. So that's like paper beats rock. But if you just have the immune types, the immunity is sort of costly, or for some reason, there's not a good reason to have it. So if everyone's immune, but nobody's producing it, doesn't do any good. And so as a result, the regular type takes back over. And so then that scissors beats paper. And so you have in this population that same kind of structure. And in fact, we found that bacteria play rock, paper, scissors with each other, at least these particular type of bacteria.
Wow. So how about the viruses then? Are they playing a more advanced form of game theory?
Exactly. And that's a big thing. And there are several different interesting game theoretic interactions going on here, right? Where viruses are, in a certain sense, playing a game against our immune system, where our immune system wants to stop them, but they want to try and find ways to evade our immune system. So that's a game theoretic interaction. They're also playing a game against one another. So, for instance, this is a tricky problem for, like, if you're a virus, ideally what you'd like to do is get the person just sick enough that they keep walking around. Right? Because if you get them so sick that they die or stay at home, you're not finding other hosts to infect. But each individual virus has an incentive to reproduce a little faster. They're playing a little tiny prisoner's dilemma with each other, where each of them has an incentive to reproduce more. But if they reproduce too much, they cause too much damage and they kill their host, or they make their host really sick or something like that. And so actually in addition to playing a game against us, they're playing a game against each other that is determined by how much damage they do to their host and how fast they do it.
This has been fascinating and illuminating. Thank you to our guest, Kevin Zollman, and thanks to you for listening. Be sure to tune in for part 2 of Game Theory Decoded, where we'll continue our conversation with Kevin about ways that game theory is being applied in the real world for positive social impact, and some exciting new development in the future for game theory. Please check the show notes where you'll find links to additional resources for this episode. And to learn more or contact us with a story, idea, or comments, please visit cmu.edu/What's Next podcast. If you are enjoying this show, please rate and review us on your favorite podcast site and share with friends. Be sure to subscribe so you'll never miss an episode. I'm Randy Scott, and you've been listening to Where What If Becomes What's Next from Carnegie Mellon University, where we are asking the bold questions that become innovations for the betterment of humanity. Stay tuned and stay curious.